Washington Historical Society owns two properties. This is the Zinsser House, which was the home of Dr. Harley Zinsser until his death around 1942. The Village Doctor Museum is the other property owned by the Society. The building was erected in 1916 as the office of Dr. Zinsser. When he retired in 1932, Dr. Lee Monroe used the building as his office. In fact, this building has never been used for anything other than a doctor's office until now. And now the building is known as the Village Doctor Museum. The Village Doctor Museum is really an educational building. When you step inside the building, you will note that it is a very simple structure and very simply furnished on the inside. All the furnishings, the medical cabinetry, the medical tools were used at one time or another by Dr. Zinsser or Dr. Monroe. All the furnishings which you find in the building have been given to the Society by the descendants of the two doctors. This building, again, is an educational institution, and it is meant to provide some local history for adults and the children of the community. To really understand the work of these doctors and the conditions they worked under 60, 70 years ago, we need to talk to some Washington residents who were patients of the doctors. And I think they have some good memories to share with us. So introductions are in order.
Bill Bradle.
Jean Keeley.
Julie Christian.
Joyce Nordhelm.
We have two middle school students who are with us and who are going to be leading off with some questions. And so at this time I'd like for them to introduce themselves.
I'm Abigail House.
I'm Megan Llewellyn.
Very good. All right, and let's now begin with the questioning, and if you have a question to pose there now, well, this is the time to do it.
We would like each of you to tell of a special memory you have of receiving medical treatment or help from one of the doctors.
I have one story in particular. I think it was in 52 or 53, and I was either a junior or senior in high school, and Tully's drugstore used to be on the square, and they had a stone step in front of there that was worn, and it was raining, and it was particularly slick. And there was an awning overhead with a bar, and I had a class ring on, and I walked out and grabbed a hold of the awning and stepped off the step, then I slipped, and it pulled my ring clear up to the end of my finger and basically skinned my finger. It was about 10 o'clock at night, and there wasn't any doctor's offices open, so I went down to Dr. Monroe's house, and he looked at it, and he said, well, I can't do anything until you get that ring off of there. So then I went down to Harry Kimpling's that used to be in the alley, plumbing shop, and woke Harry up, and he came out in his shop and cut the ring off, and I went back down to Dr. Monroe's about 11 o'clock at night, and he sewed it up and put a bandage on it for me. Today's world, I don't think that'd happen.
My husband used to travel, and one week he had gone out of town and I became ill. And Dr. Monroe came every morning by 8 o'clock, gave me a shot, and sat and talked with me for quite a while. He finally thought I was sick enough that he called my family home to take care of me. No doctor does that anymore either.
When I was, a baby, my family, Betty and Virgil Thomas, took me to Dr. Monroe, and I got all my childhood shots. there, and Mom and Dad always used to say that he was the only one that could give me a shot that I wouldn't cry. So Mom always said his shots were painless, totally painless. And I remember one time when I was 4, Mom took me in there for, I had a wart on my thumb. And she just thought, well, you know, while we're here, we'll just see what to do. He said, well, you get some boiled linseed oil, you put that on there, and you wrap it up real good, and you don't look at it for a week. And when you take the Band-Aid off, it'll be gone. And Mom thought that was a bunch of hooey, but we did it anyway, and by golly, he was right. It wasn't even there, and I couldn't believe it. But Mom said that he forgot more than most doctors knew back then.
I remember one day going into Dr. Monroe's office, and I was probably a teenager. Doc didn't do a lot of medicine. He tried to use common sense and things like that would allow you to take care of it yourself. But that day he must have decided that I did need a shot of something or other. He had on his little table next to the chair that you sat in when he treated you a hot plate. And on the hot plate there was a white enamel pan with the red ring around it that I'm sure lots of people remember using. That's where he boiled his needles. Of course, in those days they used their needles over and over again. This day he must have been in a hurry because he didn't do that. He assembled his hypodermic, squirted lighter fluid on it, set it on fire, filled it, and gave me a shot. And I'm here to tell a story, so I guess that doesn't hurt.
Did you go to Dr. Zinzer or Dr. Monroe? And did everyone in your family go to the same doctor?
I went to Dr. Monroe, so did my husband, and 3 of my children did.
No.
Actually, 5 generations of our family went to Dr. Monroe. I remember I wasn't very old, probably 8 years old, when my great-grandmother, who was living with my grandmother, passed away. Her name was Vincent, and he was her doctor, and he pronounced her dead in the home. My grandmother and grandfather, of course, both went to him. My mother and father also. He delivered me and all 5 children. All of our 5 children were patients of his until the day he retired, and we didn't want that day to come, but it did.
Mm-hmm.
What years did he treat you? And what age were you when he did treat you?
I was 30 when we started going to him.
I was just a wee tyke, this long, till I went to 1st grade, and then I think that's when he retired.
Dr. Monroe delivered me on Pig Alley, Peoria Street and Pig Alley, in May of 1932. I may have been his first baby, if not, I was one of the first that he delivered here in town. And I went to him I think it was 2 days before he retired was the last time I saw him.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Did he ever treat you for an emergency illness or injury? Please describe the situation.
In Peoria, I had to stop and get a flu shot before I could go to teach, and so I had to go at 7 o'clock in the morning. He met me at the office to give me a flu shot, and I suffered the rest of the day.
Yes, I remember one time in particular I fell up some steps that were in front of our home, and it was after hours, and we too went to his home, went up the steps, and he had whatever it took to patch that up. He also took care of a finger of mine that I was in the 5th grade, and I caught a fly ball during lunch hour, and when I got rid of the ball, I looked down at my hand and my finger had dropped. And so I went to him that evening to see what he could do with that finger, and he said nothing. And I'm sure my face must have dropped, and he said, I'll put a splint on it, but it won't do it any good. So he did, and it didn't. So he knew what was going to happen.
All right.
What was the usual routine when you went for a checkup?
Anyone?
And you went in, sat down, in turn, you would take your turn. He would stick his head out the door and say next, and people were polite enough to keep the order straight, and they would go in. He did not take appointments. I suppose if you were bleeding, he might have done a little triage and let you in first, but just on the normal basis, you just waited your turn.
How often did you see the doctor on normal checkup days and also emergencies, etc.?
Gosh, you know, in those days, you really didn't have your scheduled physical exams like you do now. You just went when you didn't feel good is what you did. And he was always there and always waiting for you. And I remember he always, when I was 5 years old, and he was pretty, this was back in the 1950s, he was pretty well up there, and he charged $2. But if you didn't have $2, that was okay. You could pay him the next time you came in.
I remember going one time and, with 5 children. Maybe you didn't go very often, but with 5 children, that was still a lot of visits during the year. And every time I'd go, I'd say, Doc, how much do we owe you? And he'd always say, oh, I don't know, I have to look at my book. So one day I said, Doc, you don't have a book, do you? He said, no. So when you pinned him down finally, he would say $13. And so I'd write out a check for $13, and it may be 6 months before you did that again. But he always knew when you walked in what was wrong with you. He just had a common sense about him.
Go ahead.
All right. Describe what you didn't like about visiting the doctor.
I don't know that there was anything that like about visiting the doctor because he was so interesting to talk to. He was just a fine person.
Did it ever scare you going to the doctor, or like hurt when he was giving you treatment or anything?
I don't remember any fear. He just had such a calm, confident way about him that I didn't fear whatever he was going to do to you.
Outside of his office, do you remember seeing the doctor, like at a church or the square or at parties?
I remember seeing him uptown walking around the square, and I think he'd go over to sometimes to Mickey's Lunch for dinner. And then I also worked in the meat market when it was Finley's on the south side, and he used to come in there at lunchtime sometimes and just get something to make a sandwich with and then go back to work.
His wife was sort of incapacitated. I don't think they did much socially. At least I was never involved in anything they did socially. So I too only saw him when he'd be walking through the square at some point.
All right. Did the doctor ever make a house call to your home? As we've heard that he did, but do you have a special situation that you'd like to describe?
Well, my mother used to have incapacitating headaches, and where she could hardly move her head, and he would come quite often and give her I think a shot of some kind that took care of it. So I do remember him coming.
What tools do you recall the doctor using on you or someone else?
I can remember when he sewed up that finger, it was like a needle and a thread in it, but it was curved. It had a curve to it, like the end of a fish hook. And there was no medication or anything, and I don't remember it feeling that bad. I mean, he was very gentle when he did it.
All right. How long did you usually have to wait to see the doctor when you went to his office?
You had to wait till the person ahead of you was had their turn. Because he didn't take appointments, he just took you in order. And I think as Joyce said, everybody took their turn.
They did.
Nobody
Right.
cut in or
Nobody jumped the
anything.
line.
And it was never too long.
Never too long, though.
No. You could always socialize in the waiting room.
Right. And sometimes you would go to the office, and he had a little sign sitting on the table. I can't remember exactly what it says. One side said "Doctor is in." The other sign had something to do with what wasn't in, but he'd be right back. And you just sit there and wait till he came, because he, like Bill said, he probably was down at one of the stores picking up a sandwich or something.
Well, if you have any more stories that you'd like to share, feel welcome to right now. But that is the end of our questions.
I have another story in particular. It was probably 54, 55, and I was in the apprentice course at Caterpillar, and we went around and worked with all the different journeymen. And one man in particular that I was working with was from Canton, and he had ulcers that he'd been bothered with his whole life. And I'd recalled that somebody in Washington had told me that they had ulcers and they went to Dr. Monroe and he cured them. So I told this man about that, and he made a special trip out to Washington one night after work. And about a month later, I saw him, and he said, "You know," he said, "I really appreciate you telling me about that." He said, "Dr. Monroe cured my ulcer." And I said, "Well, what did he do?" And he said, "He told me to get a case of 7-Up and set it in the house so it was room temperature, and every night, right before I went to bed, drink a bottle of 7-Up." And he said in about 3 or 4 weeks, my ulcers were gone.
Remarkable.
I remember one time we had just been married, and my husband was inducted in the Army during the Korean War, and we went to Texas. And while we were down there, I became pregnant, and it was almost Christmas time, and I was having a little trouble, so they put me in the hospital. Bert had already had his leave to come home for the Christmas holiday, and so he canceled it, thinking, well, we're not going home. But we always had the habit of reading the scripture when he'd come to visit me, well, every night, but when he'd come to visit me, we did. And that one particular night, we read the Christmas story. And when we finished, I looked at him and I said, "You know, if Mary could ride that donkey all the way from Nazareth to Bethlehem, I surely could ride in the back of a car." So the next day, when they were going to let me out, he went back, got his leave back. We took the mattress off the bed in our little apartment we stayed in. That tells you what kind of a mattress it was, because it folded. It folded, and we put it in the back seat of the car, and I came home, and we stayed about a week, and so then I thought, well, going back, I better go talk to Doc. So I went up and explained the whole thing to him, and he got that look on his face like he'd like to kill you. And it could be because there were times when you do stupid things and get hurt or whatever, he would give you the business about that. But he looked at me, he said, "Well, you came up here, I suppose you can go back." So that was the end of that story. We did. We went back.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that I kind of remember, as he walked around the square, or the times that I saw him out of the office, seems to me he always had on a brown pinstripe suit. Always something in brown. Do you, any of
Yeah.
you recall that?
He was not a clothes man.
No,
No,
but I
he
mean,
was-
I remember him predominantly wearing brown clothes.
Brown. I don't have the words to tell you how much Dr. Monroe meant to our family. He was more than a doctor. He was a friend and a confidant, and you just trusted him implicitly. No matter what he did or said, it was okay. And it was a sad day when Dr. Monroe retired.
The Washington Historical Society expresses appreciation for the great cooperation and the work done by students from the Washington District 52 Middle School. And a special word of appreciation to Maureen Hotkovich, their teacher, as well as to the school administration for their assistance in this fine program. We encourage one and all to visit the Village Doctor Museum.